Hi everyone, it's Dre again. I am here to talk to you today about workarounds and in particular why we create workarounds. So I do have a bit of a cold, so you'll have to forgive me if my voice sounds a little raspy. So workarounds, or the way that I define them, is they're an alternate path to accomplish a task or series of tasks. That is in some way different from the process that was designed or the process that users were intended to be following. I don't believe that workarounds are always negative, so they can be both positive and negative in nature. And in general, workarounds will give us some pretty good insight into the process areas that we can optimize. So end users rarely would create a workaround for something that is already optimized and that is sort of well understood and well utilized. They typically tend to create workarounds for things that there are some areas of opportunities with. So I pulled a couple of definitions off the web for what a workaround was. The first one's from Urban Dictionary, and it indicates that workarounds are a set of steps used to compensate for or to avoid dealing with a systemic problem instead of fixing it. From dictionary.com, they actually define workarounds as they pertain to computer use. So for them, a strategy or technique used to overcome a defect or another problem in a program or system is how they define that term. As you can see, both of these sort of focus on there being a negative connotation or a negative aspect to things. And while this is, often the case, I don't think it's always the case, as I mentioned previously. So I'm going to talk today about 5 particular reasons for developing a workaround. And these are 5 of the most common that we see in the healthcare industry or that I've seen in my work over the years. There are certainly some other reasons for their development, but these are the ones that come up the most frequently. So first and foremost, technical issues. So if there are performance issues with the application or there's a piece of equipment that isn't functioning, so your EHR is slowing down or a process is taking too long to complete, or there's a break in some integration component, so information flowing from one system to the other isn't working, things like that can lead to the creation of workarounds. Another technical issue would be error messages or a barrier in the system that's actually preventing you from completing the correct path. So error messages, hard stops is another one that comes up fairly frequently. Warning messages that seem to be in sort of never-ending loops or to create enormous amounts of clicks. Or that the required option is not available for the user. So if there's a drop-down choice, for example, that would be the most appropriate to choose clinically, but that's actually not available to you, a workaround can be created in that instance. Or if an order item is being sought and what the user is looking for is not found in the catalog. So whether that be because the item doesn't exist or because the item is labeled with something different and it's not what they're searching for, workarounds can often result from those. So the second reason is end users not being sure or aware of how a process is supposed to occur. So in this case, they may skip some tasks in the system already and look for sort of the path of least resistance. They often will follow a path that seems intuitive to them. And so we know from the way that EHR systems are designed and other application systems used in healthcare that sort of an intuitive interface is not always what we get. And so these can create some very interesting workarounds. Again, they're usually looking for the path of least resistance or something that they think that they would need to do because they aren't exactly sure how to complete it. So one of the examples would be including nursing instructions in the free text comment section of an order. So entering an order into the system, there is usually a comment box that's attached there. And often if users aren't aware of the fact that there are discrete orders for nursing instructions, they may add the instructions or some additional tasks to the actual diagnostic order. So that's one that I can use as an example for them not being aware of the process. So some workarounds are actually informally taught by a colleague, and this may be sort of an exact replica of what a colleague is doing, or it may be sort of an interpretation of what a colleague is doing. So if you think of the concept of the telephone game. So these are also known as mimicking workarounds. They may be historical in nature, so often these results from users over time being somewhat resistant to change and trying to hang on to something that they completed in a previous system or with a previous version or before a process was changed. And then they actually would communicate this and demonstrate this to future users. So it sort of perpetuates the workaround issue, and they get slightly changed along the way. This one's a big thing that you'll find in areas where there's sort of consistent amounts of change and a higher turnover in staff. So this is also something that you'll see in areas where application training is optional. So where not everyone actually has to go to training and they're relying quite heavily on being trained by colleagues, or when training scenarios that are designed with a more generic oversight and they don't have a particular clinical context in mind. So an example that I can give you for that is when I first learned how to use our order entry system many years ago, I attended a training session that was a generic order entry training session for all hospital users. I actually worked in the emergency department and we had different screens even when we logged in. So we had different pathways, order set groupings, some convenience sets. And I didn't actually learn any of these in my classes. So I was forced to have conversations with colleagues to ask them how they do things. So where do they click? How do they use stuff? What screens do I need to go through? And this informal teaching method actually transferred some of the workarounds that were being done over to me. So I actually also started using workarounds, not realizing that I was doing that, but that's how it happened. So the fourth one that can cause workarounds to be created is simply the discovery of an alternative path. So this is one where I think there are positives that do come out of this, and it's usually discovered in an attempt to make the process faster. So often they're looking for efficiencies when users create these types of workarounds and a simpler way to do things. So it doesn't always have to be a time saving. It may just be an instance where they're looking to accomplish the needed tasks or the relevant tasks by going through a sequence or steps or actions that are going to give them the same result, but result in sort of less actions along the way. So typically there would be steps bypassed or a focus on completing mandatory items. So not filling in additional components that may be helpful for system processing, but are not necessary from a clinical perspective or from a process perspective at this stage. Sometimes with the discovery of an alternate path, one of the things that happens is a group of end users or a particular role discovers that they can transfer the task over to someone else. So it's not that they're actually changing the activities that need to be done in the system. It's that the individual who is tasked with or who was designed to be completing the steps isn't the person who's actually doing it because they've offloaded it. So this is also a workaround. So again, this is also often done to improve efficiency. Usually it's for a single user or for a single group, and it's not always looking at the entire end-to-end process. So they're looking at it from their perspective or from the perspective of the other users on the unit and not sort of in the grander scheme of things. So it may actually create an efficiency for the overall, or it may not. So the last one that I want to mention is system usability. So this one is similar to the last one where they're discovering an alternative path. This one is sort of driven off the belief that the correct sequence or what they're told to do takes far too much time. This may be something that's real or perceived. It doesn't have to actually take more time. It's just that they believe that it does. And it usually results in the use of an external method for workflow completion. So users would choose to incorporate a different application or would revert to a manual process because they think it's something that's quicker. So one of the examples that I came across a lot was order reconciliation. So medication reconciliation was a process that providers got very, very used to doing in a very quick manner on paper. So they could simply write on the paper, if appropriate, that you would continue all meds. Once you get into the software systems and it's discrete orders for everything, you can no longer just sort of apply this to everything and have it be done in the stroke of a pen. You actually needed to go into each individual order and indicate whether you were continuing or discontinuing, and would it be a new prescription or would it be against the existing prescription? Was there anything that was different? It seemed to take a very, very long time. So the workaround that most sort of fell to is they went back to the manual process. And another example of this would be to use word processing apps. They can type quicker in word processing apps because they are giant free text elements essentially, and then cutting and pasting those into generic notes instead of going through a structured piece of documentation in the application where each particular field needs to be answered with drop downs, radio buttons, or text. So these two things relate directly to system usability, and often this is the one that leads us to focus on the areas for optimizing. So if you discover a workaround using with this as a cause, then chances are the overall process and design needs to be reevaluated, and things need to be easier for the end user. So what's presented to them is not something that's overly reasonable, and you need to sort of do a little bit more investigation. So those are the 5 that I think are the most common reasons for creating workarounds. I will mention that they're almost always created and perpetuated with the best of intentions. So I have never seen in my own career an example where a workaround was created and there wasn't a good intention in mind. I'm not saying that it never exists, but I've never come across that. And unfortunately, they result in can result in some unfavorable outcomes for patient care and process efficiency. So often the results of workarounds, the downstream impacts, or the subsequent sort of events that occur are not known. So they're not really well understood by the user performing the workaround. And more often than not, the experience is actually felt by individuals in a different area at a different time or with a different role. So it isn't an immediate response. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's not, which makes breaking these workflows that are developed using workarounds a little more difficult. So the cause and effect is somewhat removed. So that is the reasons for workarounds that I've come across most often. So I have a couple more videos that I'll do on workarounds. We'll talk about some of the key impacts for them and then how to evaluate. So if you like what you see, add comments below and subscribe to the channel and wait for the next ones to come up. And I will talk to you again soon.